Well, thank you for that amazing introduction, and it's a real honour to be here because my dad went to Oxford, he captained the rugby team, and my sister's now at Oxford, so I do feel like I'm sort of clinging on to this connection of Oxford, and it is a real privilege to be here. And I figured that I would just tell you a little bit about myself, about the way I got into rowing, and share a few stories about London and Rio, and really answer some of your questions if you have them at the end. When I was younger, I was really sporty, but really into anything I could get my hands on, anything I could do, especially if it was outdoors, adventurous, or to do with sport, and especially if it was competitive. And so that's what really drove me, that interest, that intrigue in about being competitive and being sporty. And when I was younger, I was about 14, 15 when I first made the international cross-country team, and I was quite good at hockey and played that to a high level. And then when I went to university, that fell by the wayside a little bit. The sport became a little bit more social, which was great, but it wasn't really feeding that competitiveness inside me. When I left university, I was 21, and I still hadn't picked up an oar. I still hadn't sat in a boat. And my mum called me up, and I remember it was the last couple of days of university, and she said, have you seen this thing called Sporting Giants? And because London had been given the Olympics, there was a massive drive to get people from different sports and different disciplines into things they haven't tried before. And I didn't know a single person that rowed. I had never even considered rowing. But Sporting Giants was looking for people with one attribute. They were looking for people who were tall. And you had to apply online and get funneled into a sport that suited you. So it could have been handball, volleyball, or rowing for the tall people. I knew I was taller than most of my friends, and I thought, yeah, I'm about 5'11". So I applied online, and I turned up at the day where you got tested, and I was literally looking up at everybody. I quickly realised I'm about 5'9", about 2 inches shorter than you were supposed to be. Duly stood on tiptoes to make the grade, and got asked to start rowing. And I was at this massive crossroads in my life because I was there thinking, I could be on the doorstep of a lifelong ambition. I could get that thing that I wanted when I was younger. I could go to an Olympic Games. I could be successful in sport. And I thought to myself, I'm thinking that because one guy I'd never met before told me I could be good at some sport that I'd never tried before. And I had this reality check of going, you know, really is this for you? Do you think you can do this in 4 years' time? And I truly didn't think I could. I didn't think I could do it in 4 years. But the one thing I knew is that I knew if I was watching the London Olympics 4 years later and I was sat there watching somebody else and hadn't even tried, that would have been far more difficult for me than if I had tried and failed. So I started rowing. I picked up the sport in 2008 and got onto the team 2 years later. It sounds like a very, very quick, very easy road when you talk of it like that, but it was incredibly tough. I was working as a PE teacher at the time, and I was juggling my teaching with my training, and at the same time trying to beat girls who were on the team training full time. So it meant getting up in the early hours like a lot of you rowers will be doing and training, and then going to work and teaching all day, and then coming back in the evening and training again. And it really, really was the toughest 2 years I've ever had. And when times seemed tough on the rowing team, I remembered those days and everything seemed just that little bit easier. But yeah, it was an incredible experience. And everybody knows that rowers train hard, and all the rowers in the room will be nodding their heads at this. And I'm just going to give you a little run through of what it was like. Every single day we're training usually 2 or 3 times every day. We start off in the morning with a long row. It can be maybe 1.5 to 2 hours long. The second session of the day will be either a session on the rowing machine or another row. And then the third session will be a weight session. So it's full time. We're there from 7:30 in the morning and leaving at about 5 in the evening. And we do this every single day. We get a day off every 3 to 6 weeks. We'll get a Sunday off. So it really, really is a huge commitment, both physically and mentally, and I'm absolutely dragging myself to training most days. And some days you get in and it looks like this. It is just beautiful, and you just think, I am the luckiest person in the world. I couldn't wish for anything more than to do this as a job. Look what I get to do. And then some days you get in and it looks like this. and you're breaking the ice to get your boat on the water, and your coaches are standing there saying, no, you're going out, or you'll find a river to use, or you'll get out and you'll train every single day. So come rain, come shine, come snow, anything, you're training. And you have days where you get home and the blisters on the palms of your hands are almost the size of your hand, and you're thinking, I'm going to have to pick up an oar tomorrow, and I'm going to have to row on this for hours and hours. And all those little things, all those little sacrifices, you do know is going to be worth it. So all that training equates to a lot of energy, and one of the major perks from being a rower is that you get to eat a lot. On training camp, I can eat up to 6,000 calories in a day, and at home, that's about 4,000 to 5,000 calories. It's a lot of food, and the other day I was watching TV and I was watching a strongman competition, and there was a guy who was about 24 years old, and he was huge, and he was there talking about how much he eats, and he was saying, yeah, I eat 6,000 calories a day, and I was like, yeah, mate, I could take you down. That's nothing. But I try to eat fairly healthily, but absolutely with those 6,000 calories, you can kind of not think too much about what you're eating as long as you're getting enough energy and refueling for the next day. So with all that in place, meeting Heather, getting onto the team, we made it to the team for London 2012. It was such an incredible feeling, knowing that I had made my first dream come true. I was going to be an Olympian. But by the time we got to London, not only were we thinking about being Olympians, we were genuinely thinking about winning a gold medal. We had progressed so much and so quickly in that short time frame through that absolutely perfectly executed training that we were very genuinely thinking, if I don't come away from this with a gold, I'm going to be disappointed. Now, the rest of the world didn't know that. We were relative unknowns. When the interview requests came into GB rowing, we'd scan down and we go, oh, we're going home then. Our names weren't on the list for the interviews. Our names weren't on the list for the who to watch. And that was fine by us. We didn't want any of the pressure. We actually sort of turned our backs to any of that kind of interest because we knew that it was our first Olympics. We had enough pressure on ourselves. You could only do it quietly once in your life, and that's what we chose to do so. I remember when we were at the Olympics, and you kind of got this sense that everybody, all the athletes were on the cusp of the biggest day of their lives, and they knew it. And there's just this sense of, when you look people in the eye, it's just a mixture of terror, excitement, fear, ambition, all rolled into one. And you know that all that training that you've done is going to come down to this. You take about 4 million strokes in an Olympic cycle, and that's 16,666 practice strokes for every one single stroke that you're going to take in your final. And everybody's petrified that one of those strokes could be the one that either wins or loses them the race. And I remember the day before our final, I went for a physio session, and there were about 3 or 4 physios, 3 or 4 athletes in this room. And because of that tension and that pressure, it was silent. You could just cut the atmosphere with a knife. And so to kind of bring everybody's tensions down and to relax the room, the physios grabbed the TV remote and just put on something nice and calming. They put on the One Show, just nice and run-of-the-mill, the One Show. So we were sat there getting a leg rub. And next on the One Show, we find out why athletes crack under pressure. Why in this Olympics have we not won any golds and it's day 4? Suddenly everybody's scrabbling for the remote. Nobody can find it in the panic. They pull the plug out from the wall, and trust me, that TV did not get turned on at all for the rest of the Olympic Games. But it really was this kind of idea of actually the world is watching, no matter how much Heather and I have shied away from it, no matter how much we've pretended it's normal and that nobody's watching and nobody cares. This is a home Games. This is so special, and we are so lucky to be here, but it comes with added pressure. And that really hit home again the next morning when we came down for breakfast on the morning of our final, on the morning of the biggest days of our lives, and on the front page of every single newspaper said, day 5, missing, gold medals. Is this going to be the game of no golds? And everybody remembers the London Olympics as being this hugely successful Games, which it was, but it's easy to forget that it wasn't until day 5 that we got that first gold. And Suddenly, we had the nation's hopes on our shoulders because you turned to page 2 of the same newspaper and there was a big picture of me and Heather saying, tune in at 11 o'clock this morning to see if we can win our first gold. So we had this big reality check that people were watching and waiting with anticipation. And when we got down to the course, that was absolutely evident. Normally we get there at about 5:30, about 6 in the morning, and we do one lap of the course, just to get our nerves out the way, to release some tension, to just do a paddle nice and quietly. Often we go to World Cups and World Championship regattas, there might be one man and his dog walking around, maybe a family or two finding their early seats, and you go around in relative silence. We put our boat on the water and it was like we were boating for the final. It was 6 in the morning, we heard this roar and we heard our names shouted from the banks and we looked up and the stadiums and the stands were virtually full. Hours before our race, people were there and people were supporting, and we did that whole loop at virtually race pace, full of adrenaline, came off far more anxious than we were when we first began, and we needed to come back and chill ourselves out before we raced. Now, the race itself went according to plan. There were no fireworks, no sparks, but it did go according to plan. We got out hard and fast, as we usually do in our World Cup racing, and when we came into that last tunnel, that volume of noise was deafening. We had discussed with each other what would happen if Heather couldn't hear me. So I do the race calls in the boat, and we said, you know, if Heather can't hear me, we know the race plan and we execute it no matter what. But what I hadn't prepared for was in the last few minutes of that race, when I did the calls to Heather, I couldn't hear myself. It was like being in a nightclub where you're shouting and you can't even hear your own voice. It was that loud, the crowd shouting beside us. So an incredible experience, and when we crossed the line, it was just this feeling of relief. And everybody said, you know, what did it feel like? How was it? And I feel like it was this moment that I had waited my life for, and I knew what I should feel, and I knew the emotions that came with it because I've thought about it since I was this big. I knew I should feel excited and happy and relieved, and to be honest, I felt like I was living it through somebody else's eyes, through somebody else's body. I felt so tired, emotionally drained, and I was living the emotions but feeling so detached from them. We'd been very naive in the build-up because we hadn't had that interest from the media. We'd arranged to meet our families at about 5 o'clock that night in the pub for a celebratory drink. It was just ridiculous. We were whisked away in a car, and we weren't back till 3 in the morning because we'd been doing back-to-back interviews. In 24 hours, we had met Usain Bolt, and our faces were on stamps. It was absolutely ridiculous. But it was an honour to be part of the home games. So what happens next? When you've achieved your childhood dream and you've done all you want to do, how do you make that decision about whether to carry on? Now, for me, I think that decision was quite simple. It was made long before London. I always knew I was going to carry on, and largely that's because I always knew I had more to give. I wanted to carry on the sport because I felt like I was progressing so quickly and so much coming into London, purely because I hadn't been in the sport for very long. So Rio was going to be where I was going to set my sights. And Heather and I both sat down and said, well, clearly it has to be gold in Rio. We have to be going for the win in Rio. But we'd given it everything in London. We had poured our hearts and our souls and our training and our social lives, and everything went into winning in London. So how do we become better? The result we got in London was not going to be good to win enough to win in Rio, and we knew that. So we sat down and we kind of really got to the nuts and bolts of what's going to make us faster. How can we be different when we thought we were doing everything we could already? And one of the things is science, and you'll notice I use the picture of Heather here rather than me because it's not the most flattering picture. So we use science quite a lot in our training. We were already using it, but we really thought, okay, how can we develop this idea even more? So on a lot of the ergos, or the times we used the rowing machine, we would have our gas analysed and the blood lactates analysed, and rather than just kind of letting the coaches mull over the results, we would try to look at it and understand a little bit more about our physiology. The other things that we discussed were really simple things that I actually think are very valuable in real life, and now I've taken a step back from rowing for this year. They're things that I think are really useful for anybody and for everybody. We spoke about diet. There are small changes we could make to our diet, which even though we were getting all these calories in, what could we do to make sure we were optimally fueled the whole time and eating the right things? And something that I think is really useful is doing something, for me, like a smoothie in the morning. So having a green smoothie in the morning and just knowing that by 7 a.m. I've already had a load of fruit and veg and feeling like that set me up well for the rest of the day. I think doing something positive nutritionally first thing in the morning means that you're in that mind frame for the rest of the day. Something that students will probably be fairly familiar with is caffeine. We spoke about the use of caffeine and how we were using it already and what we could improve. For me, that meant not really touching caffeine at all during training and then using it when the time is right. It can be a really powerful tool if you use it when the time's right. And again, something that students may not be so familiar with, but sleep. Sleep is something which is so vital for your well-being, for your health, for your body, for your mind. And it's something that can go lacking, I think, in most people. Most people, I think, would benefit from more sleep. So for me, I love to nap. So this was a great one for me, and I added naps into my day. And the days that I napped, the following sessions and the following days were of a higher quality and a higher standard because my body had just that little bit more recovery. So using these things, we got to Rio in really, really good shape. We actually were undefeated for that whole Olympiad, and that took a lot of grit and a lot of determination, and the pressure when we got to Rio was almost a polar opposite when we got to London. Even though London was a home games, like I said, we didn't have that interest and we didn't have that level of pressure and expectation. The expectation that came with Rio was that we had virtually won before we got there. And that is the last thing we wanted people to feel. It was horrible, actually. Heather and I, knowing that we were going there to try and win to defend our title, we knew that we were trying to win. We knew we were going to try and give it our all. And every interview we did, pretty much, people were talking about it as if we had got it sewn up, as if we had already done it because we'd won every race in the build-up. And for Heather and I, that couldn't have been further from the truth. We felt that, rather than making it easier to win, by being the ones to beat, people were there with targets on our backs to absolutely take us out. So it was a very, very stressful situation being in Rio. And the morning of the race, it all came to a head where we were feeling really, really anxious, really, really aware of what people were expecting from us. And we went out to stretch at about 5 a.m. It was still quite dark and it was pouring down with rain. And we spotted in the distance our physio there sheltering under an umbrella, and we walked over there and we were so serious, and we both looked tired and we looked drained and we looked like we just wanted this to be over and the whole world was watching us. And as we were there stretching, one of the bars in Rio opened its doors and all the people who'd been clubbing all night just poured out onto the streets around us, and they came and walked past us and sat down with us and started asking us what we were doing. And it kind of gave us this hugely refreshing feeling of they don't know and they don't care. We feel like the world cares and we feel like the world is watching, but really, really, nobody cares as much as Heather and I do. Our families will love us no matter what. The world will keep turning, the sun's going to come up the next day, and these people are going to keep partying. And it gave us this huge sense of scale and a huge sense of what it really meant. And what it really meant was that it was important to Heather and I. And so we weren't going to let any external pressure, any external expectation have any part in what we were about to do. So we just kind of stayed totally grounded, remembered our journey, and remembered it was just about us and not about anybody else. Again, the race in Rio, it did go to plan, but there were 3 crews behind us all fighting for the remaining medals. So Heather and I got quite a big lead out in front, and then these crews, there were 3 crews going for the remaining 2 medals, and they kept pushing and pushing, which was great for us because we knew that would happen. We predicted it happening all the way through the season, and it meant that we had to keep racing to the line and really keep holding our heads. The feeling of crossing the line in Rio was amazing. It genuinely was amazing. So in London, I couldn't call myself Olympic champion for about 6 months. And if I was introduced to a room like this as an Olympic champion, I would feel like they were talking about somebody else. I felt so detached from it. But having the 4 years to get used to that title, as soon as we crossed the line, that moment I knew we had done it. So that whole 4 years was worth it for feeling what I wanted to feel the first time round. So it was relief and elation and an absolute acceptance and appreciation of the fact that I had managed to defend my title. And so I guess that takes me to what now? The decision to carry on to Rio for me was a fairly obvious one. But the decision to carry on to Tokyo is not as obvious. So I've taken a year out now. And I thought that by now I may have come to a decision about whether I'm going to carry on rowing or not, but it's really not that easy. I think Heather has retired, so I wouldn't be going back into a boat with Heather. Also, I have achieved essentially the things I want to achieve. It's really, really important to go into an Olympic cycle with an absolute clarity on why you're doing it. And I think I want to spend the next few months thinking about having that clarity. I need to know that I'm going to wake up every morning and not have to answer the question of why on earth am I doing this? Because you ask yourself that probably every day, whether you're on a rowing machine or you're on a lake or you're lifting weights or you just don't want to get out of bed, you say, why am I doing this? And if the answer comes to you really, really easily, then it's fine and you can answer that question and you can carry on. If that question becomes harder and harder to answer, then I'm not sure I'd have the motivation to carry on with the same intensity as I have done. So this next few months is about answering that question. But thank you very much for having me here today. I hope you enjoyed my story and I'm really happy to answer any questions that you have.
Hi, I wanted to ask you, what did you learn, if anything, in your experience of competitive sport at such a high level? Like, is there any lessons, or is there anything that I don't know, helped you or made you better that you figured out in your time?
I think one of the first things, and I feel especially kind of passionate to say it to kind of this age group, is that it's genuinely never too late. So I started rowing when I was 21, but it goes for sport and it goes for so many different things. It really is never too late. And I think I surprised myself about the fact that I could start something and excel in it in just 4 years. But it did make me think about, okay, how many times do you miss opportunities because you think, that probably wouldn't be me, or I'm probably not good enough, or it's probably a bit too late. So it taught me a lot about taking opportunities. And every time I think back to what kind of the shift was, and it was the I would hate to look back and not know. I'd hate to not try. And failing is fine, but not trying for me was the thing that was the most important. And in terms of competitive sport, I would say something I've learned is the team around you. So the relationship I had with my coach and Heather was absolutely fundamental to our success. It's a large part of the reason we all carried on for another 4 years. The three of us working together as a tight unit really made me feel the role of relationships. I always felt, you can be a lone wolf and you can go and the harder you try, the more likely it is you succeed. But actually, that energy spent in creating good relationships, rather than just focusing on yourself, is energy and time really, really well spent.
Is there anything you wish you'd done differently about the rowing for the 4 years, or maybe how you chose to row in a double, things that kind of decisions you made? I don't know. Yeah,
I think it's a really interesting one. I think if I could do anything differently, it sounds really strange, but I think I would have almost documented it a little bit more. I think I was really paranoid at the time. I thought, if I take a little video of this, or if I take a photo, if I write down a few thoughts, then I felt like that was me being a little bit too assured, or a little bit too cocky, and a little bit too, I'm going to look back on this with really fond memories. But I didn't do enough of that. I didn't really document enough of what happened, because it is an amazing journey, and I'm fortunate that I've got Heather and Robin that I can I can talk about it and I can have those memories with them for the rest of our lives. But we've got so much technology now that I kind of think actually some people are really, really good at taking little videos and little snapshots of life, and it's something that I'm going to have to describe to people and talk to people about. And so, yeah, if I could do anything differently, I probably would have just taken care to kind of collect a little bit more of a feel of information, yeah.
What's the hardest erg session you've ever done?
So in terms of boredom and just sheer kind of mind-numbing erging, it would be probably the 24, 26k ergs we would do, and we, yeah, they were just, you know, you sit on the erg for a couple of hours and you just feel like that's a long time in your life to be sat on a row machine. But for me, something I did in 2016, I hadn't had, in the early part of the year, I had a virus. And so I felt around Christmas time, I felt like I was playing catch up a bit. In an Olympic year, I've been so healthy in the rest of my career, and I was very frustrated over Christmas because I was healthy again, but I was a little bit behind the fitness goals that I'd set myself for. So we got sent home for Christmas for about 10 days where you follow a training program. And I decided on those 10 days to follow the program, and on each of those days to do a 24k ergo, which was horrible at the time. But I sat on the start line in Rio, and that was in my mind. That what I had put into practice was in my mind. So it was horrible and mind-numbing. Other than that, I'd say 5k flat out is pretty horrible, because it's, you know, you're doing it for a long time, and it starts hurting after 30 seconds. And then you've got to go harder and harder and harder. And I think that the thing with rowing is that it never gets to a cruise point where you're not hurting. So yeah, that's probably the worst thing about 5k.
If I can follow up on that, so what keeps you motivated then when you are thinking this erg is horrible, I want to stop? What keeps you going?
Yes, I think there were two things that I do when I'm thinking about pushing myself when I'm hating the training that I'm doing. So the first would be distraction, and that would be things like listening to music, thinking about what I'm going to have for dinner that night, thinking about anything other than the pain that I'm going through. And that works fairly well for long ergs where the score's in front of you, and if you fluctuate or deviate off that score, you can generally sort it out. That distraction technique doesn't necessarily work when you're being timed or when you're thinking about technique or really having to push yourself. So it's all about being in the moment then. And my strategy for that, for getting through the pain, is absolutely about my competitors. So I will think about the competitor. I do the calls in the boat as well. So if Heather and I are going along doing a piece and we're visualizing, I'll say 10 strokes for the Americans. I'd say this is to beat the Kiwis. This is, you know, anything that kind of brings you into what your ultimate goal is, which is to be the best in the world. Bringing that into training and really, really bringing it to life. I just think it's, as soon as I would do one of those calls, the boat speed would drop, the rate would come up, we would find something that we didn't think we could find before. So yeah, rather than distraction, it was all about almost really pinpoint focus on why we're trying to do this and bringing out a competitive drive.
Thank you.
So Michael Phelps is famous for doing like an hour or so of mental prep per day. You've spoken about your physical prep. Obviously, what sort of mental stuff did you do? You mentioned visualization.
Yeah, I think that one of the things which is massively overlooked and is becoming more popular and more current is the psychological side of things. I'm a big fan of how much more you can gain from having the right mindset. For me, a lot of things I did day to day, I didn't really realise was mental prep and was mental training, but I look back and it absolutely was. So I would have a routine of when I got home every day, I would watch video back and I would analyse it, but mentally I was always thinking about imagining that in the context of racing. So I was always visualising the way I wanted to look, the way I wanted my rowing to be, come the Olympic final, always visualising it without realising. One of the things I did in a more sort of formal set way was think about how to react to nerves. So especially the nerves of the start line, 5-10 minutes before the start line and 5-10 minutes before boating. And the simplest and most efficient way I had of dealing with that was breathing. So thinking about my breath, making it become regular and rhythmical. And it doesn't matter if I was breathing quickly or breathing slowly, it was just the regularity of my breathing. I think that worked in two ways. It worked because physically it sort of calmed me down and made my kind of irrational thoughts a little bit more calm. And also it just kind of got me into a centered, zoned place where I was ready to race. So definitely thinking about breathing. One thing that I did for my very first international race and carried on through was have some really positive affirmations. So I did that at the same time as I thought about my breathing. I would have maybe 3 or 4 things written down the night before that I could just call upon if I needed to. And I actually found the more experienced I got, the less I needed to call upon these things. But it would be things like, I got a 2K PB 2 months ago. I got a PB in my squat. My catches are improved. We've got a world-class rhythm. Things that I know to be true and things I can call on when I start doubting myself. And like I say, I would use them quite a lot in 2010, 2011 when we were new to the international scene. But 2015, 16, I would say that I was a little bit more sophisticated in my thinking, so I didn't need to call on that so much.
Hi, Helen. First of all, thanks so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I am currently in a situation where, sort of similar to when you started off rowing and sort of trying to train by yourself, but to try and reach a team that you're not currently a part of. And I was wondering what sort of training strategies, and similar to the question a couple of questions ago, what sort of motivations you can offer me as I sort of try and go down the route of trying to pursue sport outside of university.
Yeah, I mean, I think that even though it was horrible at the time, it was the least enjoyable part of training at the time. It's probably the thing I'm most proud of when I look back in hindsight, is the way that I dealt with that training, because it is so hard to train on your own. But it gives you the opportunity to do what's best for you. And I would say time invested in technique is time really, really well spent. So for me, if the other girls in my training group were doing maybe a 12K row, and I didn't have that time, I had to rush off to school, I would do a 6K row and spend the rest of the time working on my technique. I think that pays huge dividends, especially if you're fairly new to a sport. You can line up on the start line with somebody as fit as you, and you can beat them by lengths if your technique is better. So I think that's where I invested my time really, really well. And in terms of motivation, I think that getting into a routine is something really crucial. Often, getting out the door is the hardest step to going to a training session. When you get there, it's actually okay. And it's such a tiring mental battle to have to, every single time you're taking yourself out the door, to have to work yourself up to it. But I think if you can get out of don't give yourselves almost the mental excuses. It's not a question of if I'm going to get out the door, it's I'm going to get up, have breakfast and leave. It's a difficult place to get to that, because you might need to go through weeks of a mental battle of going, I really can't be bothered, I know I should, and then eventually you do. But I think you save a lot of energy and time if you get into that routine.
I was just wondering, when you eventually come to decide you come to the end of your rowing career, with all that sort of fitness, etc., are there things which you think, oh, I'd like to have a go at this now, that stands me in good stead for these other sports?
Oh, there are so many. Yeah.
All right.
I want to do everything.
Can you give us some? You heard it here first, kind of things that you.
Well, I haven't quite pinned down what I want to do, but I mean, I have kind of started doing that a little bit. So in this last year, it's been a great opportunity for me to just try new things and try things that I couldn't do when I was rowing. So I don't know if any of you have heard of the Devizes to Westminster kayak race, but it's an ultra endurance kayak race. I did it over the Easter weekend, and it takes about 24 hours of non-stop racing in a kayak, and that was great because I kind of had to learn to kayak within 6 weeks and just do the race, and it was a totally different mental and physical challenge to anything that I've been used to before. And and then the week after I ran a marathon, and I'd never run a marathon before. So it was really, I'm just kind of, I love kind of seeing what the human body is capable of, and it is amazing. It does amaze me because I think that I keep underestimating what people are, not just me, but what people are capable of, and then you see people do amazing things. And so I'd like to kind of push that even further, and I'd love to try an Ironman. I think that's probably something that I'd like to train up for. And then some ultra endurance races like the Marathon des Sables and things like that I find really interesting and exciting, and I think rowers are quite weird, aren't they? Like, so yeah, anything that hurts.
What kind of splits do you pull during a 2K?
So my PB, what is my PB for 2K? My PB is 6:42. But I mean, it took a long time to get down to that, and I mean that sits fairly well in terms of the squad. The squad kind of, some of the bigger girls pull faster than that. Some of the other girls pull a little bit slower, but it did. I mean, I definitely am not a natural erger at all. I'm fairly small and fairly light for the rest compared to the rest of the group, and that does not bode well for my erg scores. So I had to invest a lot of time into the ergo, and something I found was just the more time you spend on it, sadly there's no shortcut really to those erg scores, and it was just spending time. And I would say actually in my first few years, the rowing machine was really what got me down, because I would see myself making improvements and progressions on the water and being faster than a lot of girls on the water, and then I would get onto the rowing machine and be dead last every time by a long way. And it kind of didn't really make sense to me at the time, because I was like, guys, I'm better on the water. That's surely where it's important. But I think in the long run, I started to understand why it's so important to have the ability to erg. I haven't been on an erg since Rio, so I'm not the biggest fan of them. But yeah, it's just one of those things that kind of does come with the territory, and I had to work very, very hard at that. I was much more natural on the water than I was on the rowing machine.
Hiya. So it's quite expensive to start rowing if you're not at Oxford and Cambridge and you aren't part of a college. And I was just wondering what you think about whether it's an inclusive or exclusive sport and things like that, because it's often talked about in relation to rowing.
Yeah, I like to think that it's quite inclusive, because I've been to lots of clubs and met lots of people who are genuinely from all sorts of backgrounds. I think that, especially post-London, there's been some really good drives to get diversity within rowing. Learn to row courses happening in a variety of schools all over the country. Learn to row courses which are accessible, and like you say, the pricing isn't as extreme. The prices have come down for people to get people into clubs. I know that the club that I'm associated with in Bath is cheaper than pretty much any sports club you could choose to join within the whole of Bath. So I think there are options there for people. I think it's people realising, I think it's changing the perspective and changing people's opinions and expectations of the sport. Because actually you can walk into a rowing club and find it the most welcoming place, the most social place, a place where actually you don't have to buy a boat. You can pay your fees and use one of the boats there. And I think that it's educating people. And I think that because I came into it later in life knowing nothing, I'm very aware of those kind of expectations and things attached to rowing. But I found it satisfyingly different to what I expected. But I think it has a way to go as well. I think things like the boat race, even though it's Oxford and Cambridge and they're two high-profile universities, really brings a lot of interest, and a lot of people know about our sport because of what's going on between two universities. I mean, you can't kind of find that with any other sport, and the interest and excitement is palpable every single time it comes around, especially now that the women and the men have that equality. I think it's a huge step forward, not just for rowing, but for sport and for GB sport as a whole. But I think we can go further with the inclusivity, but it's definitely getting there.
When you went to that selection event when you were 21, when they were looking for handball players and different sports, what did it involve, and why did you get picked from that?
So the first round of testing was just a questionnaire. We filled it in, and it had a bit about family history and your sporting history. And then they chose, from that application, they chose 3,000 boys and 3,000 girls to be tested. And I went along to this testing venue, and I was sat in a room a little bit like this with a few hundred people in. And I was sat there and they said, if you look left and you look right, you could be looking at the next Olympic champion. And I was like, I'm not looking left or right, it's going to be me. so everybody was there looking around and playing along, and I was like, no. And I think that's where I felt that little spark of determination, this is going to be my last shot. And then we all filed into a sports hall where we were tested. And we were tested on the rowing machines, but we were also tested, our jump height was tested. And then one of the main tests of fitness they used was a arm leg bike. So it's like a stationary bike, but it's also got handles on as well. And the reason they chose that was it was something that people don't tend to train on. People couldn't really train for that test because they don't really exist in gyms. So it kind of made it as fair across the board. And they were looking for potential. They weren't looking for fitness at that point in time because most people hadn't been on training programs, were new to sport. So they were looking at people's potential for fitness. And something I didn't realise until about 2 weeks ago was I got sent a book from the English Institute of Sport, and they were interviewing it was about talent identification, and they were using me as one of the case studies, and I was finding all sorts of stuff about myself I didn't know. And I didn't realise that during this test, they weren't necessarily looking for how far anybody got on the test or how fit they were. They were looking for how ready they were to push themselves and absolutely get to the edge of vomiting and get to the point of sweating and not being afraid to push yourself physically. And for the people that had that, they called them the mongrels and put an M by their name. So if you had an M by your name, you were one of the mongrels who were ready to push themselves as hard as they could. And so that's kind of the background of the tests. But it was fairly general, and there was no way. I mean, I walked away not having a clue whether I was going to be selected.
Hi, so obviously your journey to London was pretty whirlwind, loads of improvement in that time. Did you find you ever got to a point where after you've been doing this sport for maybe 6, 7, 8 years that you got to a sort of plateau point where you weren't making the improvements? And if so, how did you get through that? Yeah, definitely. I think that we always knew that probably within the cycle of between London and Rio, there would be a point that we kind of plateaued a little bit. And I think that's why we sat down and spoke about what improvements we could make, because you can spend hours and hours on the water feeling like you're getting nowhere, talking about the most minute point, like where your little finger is on the handle or something, and you can feel like you're getting nowhere. So knowing that off the water you're doing everything you can was really important, because I think in those times where we had plateaued, if we were too focused on the daily grind of getting every stroke right, it would have felt really demoralising. So we tried to broaden it out, and our coach Robin was amazing at that. So Robin is, if you think of Robin, you kind of don't really think of him as a coach. You think of him as more of an artist. He's so, he kind of conjures up an image of rowing, which if you walk past him having a conversation, you wouldn't even know he was talking about rowing. He's so descriptive in his language. And people used to take the mickey out of us quite a lot, because we would be talking about things about pole vaulting past the catch, and the boys always used to laugh at us. But I do remember one particular session where we had done well and we had beaten the boys on one of the pieces, and they came up and they said, "Oh, how did you do this?" And we said, "Well, we were putting our blade in past the white picket fence and pushing it past the," and they were like, "What? Oh right, yeah, I get it." So the way he describes kind of the stroke is kind of really, really unique. So I think in any of the times that we plateaued, he would suddenly turn around and describe it a totally different way, and he would sort of try something totally different, and next thing you know, we were kind of doing pauses in the boat with him throwing tennis balls at us and trying to catch it. So a lot of it was about refreshing and changing things up every time it was a little bit stale.
Have you ever been tempted to try rowing in summer 8s?
That is something that I'd absolutely love to do one day. Like the thing is with the way I've rowed is like I've always done it for this really serious purpose, and I've almost never done it for fun. And so I think now, especially if I do go into retirement, something I'm going to look at is where could I go and what could I?
You saying Summer 8s isn't serious?
I mean, oh no, how do I get out of this?
Sorry, hello, back again. How does rowing in a pair compare to sculling or rowing in an 8 for you? Do you find you're stronger at the smaller the boat, or?
I find it really interesting the way that some people are scullers or sweepers. For me, I really, really enjoy sculling, and I think the reason that I was in the pair was basically because Heather and I both had jobs. So we were a natural combination because we could both train at the weekends together. We trialled in the pair, stayed in the pair, and that's where we were. So there was no rhyme or reason with being in the pair. I would actually love to try a double or a single. I think that sculling for me, I really, really enjoy. Heather hates sculling. You know, any time we put in singles over the winter months, she absolutely detests it. And she's an incredible, incredible athlete. And there's Robin and I would look at her going, but you're so good in the pair. And it just doesn't transfer over to sculling for her. It just doesn't. So for her, she's definitely a sweeper. For me, in the big boats, I feel much more like you're a cog in a machine, which is great in some ways because once that machine starts, there's no stopping, and you just got to go and you've got to hold on for your life, and it hurts. And that's something that I just find so enjoyable about rowing in an 8, the few times that I have. For me, rowing in a pair, something that I liked is I like having a bit of control. And so being able to do the race calls and the bow seat and things like that was really enjoyable for me. And to hand that control over to a cox, I'd probably find quite difficult.
What's your favorite race? Like, this could be anything, like World Championships or like Ahead of the River, like literally anything.
Yeah, I think so. The best race we've ever done was probably one of my favorite venues as well. It was in 2015, our World Championship final. And it's difficult to kind of really pinpoint why it was our best race. It was a race that we rowed well, we got a fast time, we beat the field by a long way, and for being 1 year out from Rio, it was very, very exciting to see us kind of execute a performance like that. It gave us a real confidence boost, and we were just in one of the most beautiful lakes in the world. And in terms of just that kind of inspiring, exciting feeling, I think women's head of the river, or even Falls Head as well. I've loved racing in Falls Head every year, because you just get this sense of how many people are out there rowing and how many people are loving it, and the stories that's gone into every single boat is really, really different. And for some people it'll be, you know, the peak of that season, and for some people it'll be just one part of the season, and you know, 20 minutes later when everyone's finished racing, everyone has a really different story to tell about the race, about how many times they crashed, how many times they crabbed, how bad the headwind was, how bad the chop was. And I just think there's, you know, races like that really remind me how fun it is, and how there's, you know, there's anything can happen. And I love the opportunity to be able to kind of race with so many people from so many different clubs.
We've got time for one final question.
What do you think about during a race? Do you stay internal, or do you think about the competitors, or what goes through your head?
Good question. I think that when I'm racing, off the start, I think I kind of go between the two. So off the start, I'm very much internal. There's virtually no point being aware of anybody else in the field, because essentially out of the start, you're going to do the best start you can. No matter what, you're not going to change your tactics according to what another boat does. Sometimes there'll be another boat that goes off hard, but really you know yourself and you know how much you're able to put into that start, so you really don't change. Heather in the stroke seat tends to stay fairly internal and fairly focused on that stern for the entire race, just listening to my calls. After about 45 seconds will be the first point that I look up and gauge my surroundings. And I do that because at 45 seconds is roughly the point where we'll either stay at a sprinting start or we'll start pushing onto rhythm and onto pace. And I make my decision based on where we are in the field. Often, the best case scenario is that it's the perfect time for you to start finding a rhythm and finding a pace. And then after that, I would say I kind of flip between the internal and the external. I've definitely found myself having a few races where I'm too externally focused and I'm watching the opposition and reacting to them too much. And I watch those videos back and I can just see what was going on. I can see that I'm not rowing quite as well, not quite as in time with the boat as I'd like to be. And even though I'm kind of doing the right thing because I'm making notice of where we are and making sure we cross the line first, I'm not doing that in the best way with my rowing. Equally, there have been times where I've kind of been absolutely kind of trying to execute my stroke perfectly and not had quite as good an idea of what's going on in the race. And that's usually been fine for me, but Heather hasn't had the feedback she needs and she wants. But generally there's this really kind of natural kind of ebb and flow between the internal and the external. So often I have to really internalise in the third 500. That's when it starts to really, really hurt. It's also the point in the race where really looking at the other crews is not going to do a lot. If you've kind of had a decent start, you know where people are. In that third 500, it's all about getting the most out of yourself. In the fourth 500, you can look outside the boat again and make decisions about sprinting, make decisions about building for the line. I think that in the third 500, there's no question you're not going to change your tactics dramatically because you're kind of already pushing as hard as you can. So yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for. But if you could join me in thanking Helen once again for coming along this afternoon and sharing all of these